The Gilded Horizon, a chronicle of the American rush. The soil of western Pennsylvania in the winter of 1848 was a miser. It hoarded its nutrients, yielding only stones and stunted corn to Elias Thorne's breaking back. He was 28, the sole steward of a failing farm and a dwindling family legacy. His hands prematurely gnarled like oak roots, his spirit eroding faster than his topsoil. His sister, Sarah, maintained the farmhouse with a quiet, desperate dignity, mending clothes until they were more patched than original fabric. They were drowning in slow motion, tethered to the land by duty and debt. Then came the newspaper. It wasn't a local gazette, but a battered copy of the New York Herald brought to the Oak Haven General Store by a traveling drummer. The headline screamed in ink that seemed blacker than sin. G-O-L-D. In California, Elias stood in the pungent warmth of the store, smelling of wood smoke and dried apples, and read the words that would set fire to his life. President Polk himself had confirmed it to Congress. The accounts were fever dreams made print, rivers paved with bullion, nuggets the size of hens' eggs prized from the earth with hunting knives, men making a year's wages in an afternoon. It was a lie, of course. Deep down, the pragmatic farmer in Elias knew that nothing on God's earth was given without a blood price. But it was a magnificent, intoxicating lie. It was hope packaged as geology. That night, the silence in the farmhouse was heavier than usual. Elias pushed his plate of watery stew aside. "I'm going," he said. His voice sounded unfamiliar, rough with a sudden, terrifying resolve. Sarah didn't look up from her knitting. "To Pittsburgh, we need salt. To California." The knitting needles stopped. The silence stretched, taut and brittle. When she finally looked at him, her eyes held not surprise, but a profound, exhausting resignation. "You will die out there, Elias. The Indians, the fever, the distance. It's thousands of miles of wilderness. We are dying here, Sarah, just slower. The bank will take the farm by autumn. You know it." He leaned across the rough-hewn table. "The horizon out there, they say it glows. If even half the stories are true, I can bring back enough to pay off every cent. We could breathe again." He mortgaged the farm. It was a betrayal of his father's ghost, gambling the past for a theoretical future. He bought a sturdy wagon, 3 yoke of oxen that looked at him with ancient, indifferent eyes, and enough flour, bacon, and coffee to feed an army or bury one. Leaving was a blur of tight throats and tearless goodbyes. Sarah pressed their mother's small Bible into his hand. "Don't lose your soul hunting for rocks, Elias," she whispered. He didn't look back as the oxen leaned into the yoke. He kept his eyes fixed westward, where the sun was setting in a brilliant, deceptive wash of gold. The horizon was a receding promise. By the time Elias reached Independence, Missouri, the jumping-off point the fever had gripped the nation, the town was a chaotic churning of mud, livestock, and desperate men. There were lawyers from Boston in pristine boots, farmers from Ohio, and gamblers from New Orleans, all leveled by the great equalizer of the trail. Elias fell in with a loose company of 4 other wagons for protection. Among them was Silas Croft, a barrel-chested blacksmith from Kentucky, who laughed loudly and treated the journey like a protracted hunting trip, and a quiet, nervy clerk named Arthur Pendleton, who constantly scribbled in a leather journal and seemed terrified of his own rifle. The beginning was deceptive. The prairie in spring was an endless ocean of green grass, belly-high to the oxen, dotted with wildflowers. The air tasted clean. They made 15 miles a day, spirits high, singing around campfires under stars that seemed close enough to touch. Then came the Platte River. It was a miserable, shallow ribbon of sludge that they followed for hundreds of miles. The heat arrived in June, a physical weight that pressed the moisture from their bodies. The green ocean turned brown and brittle. Dust became their world. It coated their throats, stung their eyes, and gritted between their teeth with every meal. The trail began to reveal its teeth. They passed graves. Crude wooden markers already bleaching in the sun died of cholera. June 14, 1849, aged 22. Cholera struck their company near Chimney Rock. It took Arthur, the clerk. One evening, he was complaining of a stomachache. By dawn, he was a husk, drained of life with horrifying speed. They buried him in a shallow grave, wrapped in a blanket. Too exhausted for ceremony, Elias took his journal to return to his family, flipping through pages filled with optimistic calculations of future wealth. He felt a cold stone settle in his gut. The trail hardened them. The easy camaraderie vanished, replaced by a grim, silent endurance. They crossed the Rockies at South Pass, a surprisingly gentle incline that felt anticlimactic until the reality of the high desert set in. The section leading to the Humboldt Sink was a landscape handcrafted by the devil. The water was alkali, bitter, and poisonous. The oxen grew lean, their ribs showing like the staves of a barrel. Elias learned the true weight of possessions. The trail became a graveyard of dreams, discarded for survival. They passed mahogany bureaus, dragged from Philadelphia parlors, abandoned iron stoves, crates of law books, anvils all jettisoned to lighten the loads of dying teams. Silas, the boisterous blacksmith, grew sullen. His wagon broke an axle in the deep sand. In a fit of sun-mad rage, he shot his lead ox when it collapsed, then sat in the dust and wept. Elias helped him salvage what he could, loading it into his own groaning wagon. "It ain't worth it," Silas muttered, his lips cracked and bleeding. "No gold is." "It ain't worth it," Silas muttered, his lips cracked and bleeding. "No gold is worth this." But they couldn't turn back. The only way out was through. They crossed the Sierra Nevada just before the snows began to fly, cresting the summit and looking down into the haze of the Sacramento Valley. It didn't look golden. It looked brown, dry, and terrifyingly vast. But they had made it. They were alive. Sacramento City was less a city and more a frantic, muddy hallucination. It was a canvas city of tents and hastily thrown together shacks, vibrating with an energy that bordered on mania. The prices were the first shock. Elias sold his exhausted oxen and wagon for a fraction of their worth to buy basic mining gear. A shovel cost $10. A simple tin pan, $5. A meal of questionable meat and hardtack was a king's ransom. The gold they hadn't yet found was already flowing out of their pockets into the hands of merchants who were the true kings of this new world. He headed toward the American River to a place called Coloma, near where Marshall had first found the metal. The stories of nuggets lying on the ground had long since evaporated. The easy gold was gone, picked clean by the 48er. What remained was brutal, industrial labor. Elias staked a small claim on a gravel bar along the river. His life shrank to a miserable routine. He woke before dawn, shivering in his damp blankets. He stood knee-deep in snow-melt water that numbed his legs to the bone, shoveling ton after ton of river sludge into a rocker box. He rocked the cradle back and forth, endlessly, washing away the dirt, straining his eyes for the color. Usually, the riffles at the bottom held only black sand. Sometimes, a few tiny flakes gleamed dust that amounted to maybe an ounce a week, just enough to buy beans and flour to keep him alive to shovel more mud. His hands, already tough from farming, became grotesque claws, the skin constantly waterlogged and cracked. His back ached with a dull, permanent throb. He grew lean and hard. The softness of the East burned away by the California sun. The camps were lawless hives of loneliness and aggression. Men from every corner of the globe, Chileans, Chinese, Yankees, Southerners were thrown together in a stew of competition and prejudice. Saturday nights in the nearby tent town of Hangtown were explosions of cheap whiskey, gambling, and violence. Men who spent all week freezing in the river blew their earnings in an hour on the turn of a card, desperate to feel something other than exhaustion. Elias stayed away from the gambling tents. He hoarded his dust in a leather pouch hidden beneath his bedding. He wrote letters to Sarah that he knew might never arrive, lying about his prospects, telling her the strike was just around the corner. The true nature of the gilded horizon revealed itself 6 months in. Elias had been working a new section of his claim, digging deeper near a large boulder. His shovel hit something that didn't feel like rock. He pried at the clay, his heart hammering against his ribs. It came free with a sucking sound. A nugget, not a hen's egg, but substantial. Perhaps 3 ounces of pure, dull, yellow metal. It sat heavy in his palm, cold and seductive. It was more money than he had seen in 5 years of farming. A profound sense of relief washed over him, so intense his knees weakened. This was it. This was the farm saved. He made the mistake of showing joy. A whoop escaped his lips before he could stifle it. Two men working the claim upstream stopped. They were drifters he knew only as Pike and Red. Men with cold eyes who spent more time watching others than digging themselves. They dropped their shovels and waded slowly toward him. "Got lucky, huh, plowboy?" Pike asked, his hand resting casually on the pistol tucked into his belt. Elias closed his fist around the nugget. "Just a little color. Same as usual." "Didn't sound like usual," Red said, stepping closer. The air grew thick with menace. The law here was distant. The nearest sheriff was 20 miles away and likely bought. "It's my claim," Elias said, his voice tight. "Claim's only yours if you can hold it." Pike sneered. Violence in the goldfields was sudden and clumsy. Pike lunged. Elias, hardened by months of moving granite, met him with the blade of his shovel, catching him in the ribs. Pike grunted and fell back into the water. Red drew a knife. Elias scrambled backward up the bank, slipping on the wet rocks. He wasn't a fighter. He was a farmer who wanted to pay his debts. The absurdity of dying here, over a piece of yellow metal in the mud, struck him with horrifying clarity. He turned and ran toward his tent, grabbed his rifle, and leveled it at them as they crested the bank. "Get back," Elias breathed, his fingers shaking on the trigger. They stopped. The cold reality of the rifle bore held them. After a long, tense moment, Pike spat into the dirt. "Keep your rock, plowboy. Plenty more in the ground." They retreated, but Elias knew it was over. They would be back tonight or the next night. The nugget wasn't salvation. It was a target on his back. That night, he didn't sleep. He sat in the dark, rifle across his lap, the nugget heavy in his pocket. He thought of Sarah. He thought of the rocky soil of Pennsylvania. He realized he hated gold. He hated what it did to men, the madness it induced, the violence it birthed. The horizon wasn't gilded. It was stained with blood and mud. 2 weeks later, Elias stood on a hillside overlooking the sprawling, chaotic mess of San Francisco. The bay below was a forest of masts, hundreds of ships, abandoned by crews who had run for the hills, now rotting at anchor. He had cashed in his dust. The nugget, along with his months of meager savings, amounted to $600. It was a fortune, enough to save the farm back home, enough to buy seed and livestock for years. He had a ticket for a steamer leaving the next morning for Panama. From there, he would cross the Isthmus and catch a ship to New York. Could be home in 2 months. He should have felt triumphant. Instead, he felt a strange, hollowing emptiness. He walked through the bustling streets of the city that was rising from the sand dunes almost overnight. He saw brick buildings replacing canvas tents. He saw banks being built with thick granite walls. He saw merchants stocking goods from China and Europe. He walked past a hardware store. Outside, stacks of new steel. Plows gleamed in the afternoon. Sun not the fragile eastern plows that broke on Pennsylvania. Limestone, but heavy, deep-biting tools meant for breaking virgin prairie. Elias stopped. He touched the cold steel of a plowshare. He thought about the journey, the endless plains, the brutal mountains, the alkali deserts. He thought of Arthur buried by the trail and Silas broken by the loss of his oxen. He thought of the freezing river and the weight of that nugget in his hand as men tried to kill him for it. He had survived the crucible. The soft farmer who had left Oak Haven was dead, buried somewhere along the Platte River. The man standing here was forged in fire and dust. He realized something that the frenzied miners in the hills missed. The gold wasn't the wealth of California. The gold was just the bait. The real wealth was the land itself, vast, fertile valleys he had seen on his way down from the mountains. Valleys waiting for men who knew how to coax life from the soil, not just rip treasure from it. He knew soil. That was his truth. Elias walked to the steamship office near the wharf. The agent looked up, bored. Passage to Panama, leaving on the California at dawn. "You buying?" Elias pulled the ticket from his pocket. He looked at it for a long moment, seeing safety, seeing the familiar prison of his past life. "No," Elias said quietly. "I'm selling." The agent raised an eyebrow, but paid him the cash without question. Elias walked back up the hill to the hardware store. The proprietor was closing up. "That plow," Elias said, pointing, "and a wagon, and seed wheat, if you have it." The proprietor looked at Elias, at the weathered face, the calloused hands, the clear, determined hazel eyes that had lost their restless fatigue. He recognized a man who was done gambling, heading back to the mines. the proprietor asked. Elias looked toward the east, toward the distant Sierra Nevada range, now just a purple bruise against the twilight sky. The gold fever had burned out of him, leaving behind a clarity as sharp as the mountain air. No, Elias Thorne said. I'm going to the valley. I'm going to farm. He hadn't found the gilded horizon he'd dreamed of, but standing there on the edge of a new continent, with the tools of his trade ordered, and a future he would build with his own two hands, he realized he had found something better. He had found a new beginning, and this time, the ground he stood on was his own. The Alleghenies in late autumn of 1848 wrapped western Pennsylvania in a mantle of muted grays and browns. The vibrant greens of summer long since surrendered to the bite of frost. Elias Thorne, 28 years old, stood on the precipice of his family's 80 acres, which felt less like land and more like a stubborn, unyielding adversary. His hands, calloused and thick, bore the permanent stains of soil and walnut husks, testimony to a life spent coaxing. Meager yields from a terrain more suited to rock than rye. His breath plumed in the frigid air as he surveyed the lower 40, a stretch of acreage that had swallowed his father's youth and, more recently, his life. 5 years had passed since Silas Thorne had collapsed in the cornfield, leaving Elias to inherit not just the farm, but its crushing legacy of debt and disillusionment. Every season felt like a battle against an invisible enemy. Blights, early frosts, market crashes that rendered their hard-won harvests almost worthless. This year had been no different. The corn was stunted, the potatoes blighted, and the ledger book in his father's old desk told a grim, familiar story. More owed to the mercantile in Oak Haven, in the county bank, than they could ever hope to repay. His younger sister, Clara, her spirit a fragile lamp in the drafty farmhouse, did her best to keep hope alive, but Elias saw the worry lines deepen around her eyes with each passing week. "Curse this land," he muttered, the words a thin ribbon of despair lost in the vast indifference of the hills. He felt like a man trapped in amber, watching the world move on while he remained fixed, slowly suffocating under the weight of his inheritance. That afternoon, the monotony of his despair was broken by the unexpected sight of Jedediah Croft's rickety wagon rattling down the lane. A neighbor whose cynicism was as ingrained as the dirt beneath his fingernails, was returning from Pittsburgh, a rare and arduous journey. "Evening, Elias," Jedediah grunted, pulling back on the reins. His face, usually a map of long-suffering endurance, held an unusual glint in his eye. "Jed, what brings you back so late?" Elias asked, leaning against the fence. Jedediah reached under the wagon seat and pulled out a folded newspaper, its pages yellowed and brittle, clearly not local. "News, Elias. News from the other side of creation." He tossed it to Elias. "Got it from a fellow in the city. 3 weeks old, but it's got the power to change a man's mind about which fight he's fighting." Elias caught the paper. It was the Baltimore Sun, its masthead bold and unfamiliar. What news? Another war. Panic in the markets. Jedediah leaned closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Gold, Elias. Pure, shimmering gold. Found out in California. Enough to make a pauper a king in a season. President Polk himself confirmed it, they say." Before Elias could reply, Jedediah slapped the reins. "Best read it yourself. Page 2. But don't say I didn't warn you, boy. That kind of news can poison a man's peace." And with a jolt, the wagon lumbered off, leaving Elias standing alone, the newspaper cool and dry in his trembling hands. He walked back to the farmhouse in a daze, the setting sun painting the western sky in hues of impossible gold. Inside, the kitchen was warm and smelled of Clara's weak turnip stew. He spread the paper on the scarred oak table, pushing aside the pewter bowls. Clara heard back to him as she stirred the pot, sensed the shift in his demeanor. "What is it, Elias? You look as though you've seen a ghost." He didn't answer, his eyes fixed on the bold headline. "The gold region of California. Official discovery confirmed. Immense wealth waiting for the bold." He began to read aloud, his voice low and hushed, the words a strange, intoxicating melody in the quiet kitchen. "Colonel Mason's official report to Washington. Samples of pure gold dust included. Sailors abandoning ships, soldiers deserting posts. Whole towns emptying out as men rush to the foothills of the Sierra Nevada. The streams are paved with gold. A man with nothing but a pan and a strong back can earn in a week what a laborer in the East earns in a year. Nuggets the size of hen's eggs are common. It is a land of unimagined abundance, waiting for American enterprise to claim it. Clara turned, her face pale. She stared at the paper as if it were a venomous serpent. It's a lie, Elias. A newspaper lie designed to sell copies. Nuggets, like hens, eggs, it's madness. But President Polk confirmed it, Elias insisted, the words ringing with a desperate hope. It's real, Clara. It's truly real. The whisper from the West had found its way into their quiet Pennsylvania kitchen, and Elias felt it settle in his blood. A strange, persistent hum. Chapter 2. A fever takes hold. The whisper quickly became a shout, then a deafening roar. In the days and weeks that followed, the gold fever swept through Oak Haven like a wildfire. The stories, once relegated to distant newspapers, now arrived on the lips of traveling merchants and returning family members. Every stagecoach brought new tales, each more extravagant than the last. Elias, despite Clara's fervent pleas for him to dismiss it as a delusion, found himself inexorably drawn into the eddy. He heard of men from neighboring counties selling their farms, liquidating their entire lives to fund the impossible journey. The local mercantile, usually a bastion of quiet commerce, became a hub of frenzied speculation. Maps of overland routes, hastily printed and wildly inaccurate, appeared for sale next to sacks of flour, picks, shovels, and pans. Once mundane tools, transformed into implements of destiny. He rode into town one blustery Saturday. The usual farmers' gathering was supplanted by groups of men huddled in conspiratorial knots, their faces alight with a mixture of fear and ferocious excitement. Young Thomas Croft, the local smithy, a man whose family had hammered iron in Oak Haven for 3 generations, stood outside his shop, nailing a for sale sign to his workbench. Thomas, what in God's name are you doing? Elias asked, dismounting Bess, his aging mare. Thomas, his face smudged with soot, but his eyes bright with a manic energy, grinned. I'm done beating iron for pennies, Elias. I'm going to California. Heard a man can pick up 10 pounds of gold a day there. 10 pounds. He gestured wildly with a hammer. I'm selling the shop, buying an outfit, and heading for St. Louis by April. But your father's legacy. Thomas scoffed. My father's legacy is debt and aching joints. This, Elias, he tapped the for sale sign. This is a chance at a legacy worth having. Elias walked into the general store. Mr. Abernathy, the proprietor, a man usually as unflappable as a stone, was haggard. His spectacles perched precariously on his nose as he frantically ordered provisions. 100-weight of flour. Mr. Thorne, bacon, coffee, all spoken for. Everyone's buying. Everyone's leaving. Not everyone, Elias corrected, his voice hollow. Abernathy leaned closer, his voice dropping. My own nephew Elias left last night, took a stagecoach to Pittsburgh, bound for New Orleans, then a steamer around the Horn, didn't even say goodbye to his mother. He sighed, a weary, defeated sound. This fever, it changes men. Elias bought his meager supplies, but his mind was elsewhere. He wasn't thinking of the empty root cellar or the crumbling farmhouse. He was thinking of gold, glittering in riverbed, waiting for a strong back and a sharp eye. He thought of his father's ledger, the endless red ink, and a future free of its weight. He thought of Clara, her quiet sacrifices, and a life for her beyond mending threadbare clothes. The decision began to coalesce in his heart, a cold, hard knot of desperation and thrilling hope. It was a terrifying, audacious thought, a betrayal of everything he had been taught about tending the land, about loyalty to kin and hearth. But what was loyalty to a farm that was slowly consuming them? What was honor in a life of endless, fruitless toil? That night, Elias found Clara in the parlor, stitching a new patch onto his worn coat. The lamplight cast long, dancing shadows on the walls, making the familiar room feel alien and vast. Clara, he began, his voice surprisingly steady. I need to talk to you. She stopped stitching, her fingers still. She knew. She had seen the fever in the eyes of the men in town, and she recognized it now in her brother's voice. I'm going to California, he said. The silence that followed was so profound Elias could hear the frantic beat of his own heart. Clara laid the coat gently on her lap. Her face was calm, almost serene, a mask for the storm he knew was raging within her. "How?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "The farm? I'll mortgage it. It will give us enough for an outfit, for a passage, enough for you to live on until I return." He rushed the words, trying to make it sound logical, inevitable. "I can go there, make our fortune, and return. We can buy the farm back, clear the debts. We can start fresh." Clara finally looked at him, and her hazel eyes, so like his own, were brimming with unshed tears. "Our father spent his life on this land, Elias. He died on it. You would gamble his legacy, our home, for a dream, for a rumor. It's not just a rumor, Clara. It's the only chance we have. We're losing it anyway. This way, there's a possibility." He stood, pacing the small room, the words spilling out, fueled by months of suppressed despair. "I cannot watch us wither here. I cannot. There is nothing left for me here but broken plows and endless debt." "And what of me?" she asked, her voice cracking. "What of this farm? What if you don't return? What if you die, like Arthur Pendleton, or like so many others they say are perishing on the trail?" "I won't," Elias vowed, though a cold spear of fear pierced his own heart. "I will come back. I promise you. I'll make us whole again." She arose, the patched coat fallen to the floor. "You speak of promises you cannot keep, Elias. This is not about us being whole. This is about your own fever, your own dissatisfaction. You always hated this land. I hated what it did to us," he countered, his voice rising. "I hated the way it slowly strangled hope. This gold, it's a way out, a way to give us both a life, not just an existence." Clara shook her head, tears finally tracing paths down her cheeks. "It's a fool's errand. Elias, and you, a good man, are letting yourself be carried away by the madness. You will regret this." He knew she might be right. He knew the risks were monumental, the odds stacked against him, but the alternative was slow. Agonizing decline on the stubborn acres felt like a fate worse than any desert or mountain could offer. "I've made my decision, Clara," he said, his voice quiet, resolute. "I have to try. I cannot stay." The gold fever had taken hold, sinking its shimmering hooks deep into his soul, severing the ties that bound him to his past. Chapter 3. Leaving the Hearth. The early spring of 1849 brought with it a frantic, unsettling energy to the Thorne farm. The mortgage papers were signed in the county seat, the legal language cold and merciless. Elias watched the bank manager's pen scratch across the parchment, sealing his fate and betting his inheritance on a dream 3,000 miles away. He felt a profound sense of both liberation and dread. With the meager funds secured, Elias plunged into the overwhelming task of preparation. He sold off most of the livestock, keeping only Bess, his aging mare, and a few chickens for Clara. He bought a sturdy canvas-covered wagon, built for the rigors of the overland trail, and 3 yoke of strong, patient oxen that looked at him with ancient, indifferent eyes. He purchased hundreds of pounds of flour, bacon, coffee, sugar, dried fruit, along with a heavy iron skillet, a rifle, ammunition, and a basic pickaxe and gold pan. Each item felt like a step further away from the familiar, toward the terrifying unknown. Clara, though still heartbroken by his decision, helped him pack with a quiet, sorrowful efficiency. She mended his strongest shirts, packed him smoked beef and dried apples, and ensured his small kit of medicines was complete. Her silence was more damning than any argument, a constant echo of his betrayal. The last morning dawned cold and clear, the sun rising over the familiar eastern hills. Elias stood on the porch of the farmhouse, the same porch where he had learned to whittle wood as a boy, where his mother had waved goodbye every morning. The scent of wood smoke mingled with the damp earth, a scent that had defined his entire life. Clara stood beside him, a small, worn Bible clasped in her hands. Her face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed from a night of silent tears. She had aged 10 years in a few months. "Are you certain, Elias?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It is not too late. We can manage. We always have." Elias looked at the land, at the familiar fields that now felt like a cage. He saw the years of endless toil, the slow erosion of hope. "No, Clara," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "It is too late to stay." He reached out and took her hand. Her fingers were cold. "I will write whenever I can, and I will return. I promise you." She nodded, unable to speak, pressing the Bible into his palm. "Don't lose yourself out there, Elias. Don't let the gold make you forget who you are." He hugged her fiercely, burying his face in her hair. Inhaling the faint scent of lavender and starch, it was a goodbye that felt like a death. He thought of his father, of the generations who had worked this land, and felt a profound sense of being a betrayer. But he also felt a surging, undeniable current of desperate hope. He climbed onto the wagon seat, the hardwood feeling strangely unfamiliar beneath him. He took up the long stick, the goad for the oxen. The animals shifted, their breath steaming in the crisp morning air. "Goodbye, Clara," he called, his voice thick. She stood on the porch, a small, solitary figure, her silhouette framed against the weathered wood of their home. She did not wave. She simply watched, a monument to his leaving. Elias did not look back. He could not. To look back was to invite doubt, to allow the gravitational pull of the familiar to drag him down. He fixed his gaze westward, where the rising sun cast a long, golden path across the dukest fields. He gripped the goad, the weight of the Bible in his pocket, a comforting, yet unsettling, presence. "Who?" he shouted, urging the oxen forward. The wheels groaned. The wagon lurched, and Elias Thorne, a farmer from western Pennsylvania, began his long, arduous journey toward the gilded horizon. He was leaving behind not just his home, but the very identity that had defined him. He was trading a certainty of struggle for a terrifying, exhilarating possibility. The road ahead was long, fraught with unseen dangers. But for the first time in years, Elias felt a flicker of something beyond despair. He felt the terrifying thrill of absolute freedom, purchased at the price of everything he knew. The endless plains, the mud of independence, Missouri, clung to Elias Thorne's boots like a hungry beast, a sticky, cloying reminder of the transition from settled lands to untamed wilderness. Thousands of emigrants, their wagons loaded to bursting, their faces a mixture of wild hope and grim determination, converged on the frontier town. The air thrummed with the cacophony of shouting teamsters, braying oxen, whinnying horses, and the constant, unnerving creak of straining wagon wheels. Elias, a solitary figure amidst the throng, navigated this chaos with the quiet wariness of a man who had left everything behind. He had chosen to travel with a small, informal company of 5 wagons, a necessary measure for mutual protection and aid. Among them were Silas Croft, the blacksmith from Oak Haven, his boisterous confidence already tempered by the sheer scale of the undertaking, and a younger, quiet man named Thomas Miller, a disillusioned schoolteacher from Ohio who clutched a worn copy of the Odyssey like a lifeline. The other 2 wagons belonged to a stern, religious family named Henderson, who kept mostly to themselves. "Looks like the whole damn country's gone mad for gold," Silas remarked to Elias as they watched. A German family attempt to maneuver an overloaded wagon through a particularly deep rut. "Ain't never seen such a sight." "Looks more like a river," Elias replied, gesturing to the churned earth. A river of desperate men. Their journey truly began with the crossing of the Missouri River. It was not the gentle stream of his Pennsylvania youth, but a wide, powerful artery of brown water, teeming with flatboats and ferries. The experience was chaotic and terrifying. The oxen balking, the wagons threatening to capsize in the current. Elias, soaked to the bone and shivering, felt the last vestiges of civilization peel away as they finally reached the western bank. Ahead of them stretched the endless plains. In the first few weeks of May, the prairie was a vision of breathtaking beauty. It was an ocean of emerald green, stretching to horizons that seemed to curve with the earth itself. Wildflowers, sunflowers, primroses, purple coneflowers painted the landscape in vibrant splashes of color. Buffalo grass, tall and lush, rippled in the gentle spring winds, a living, breathing tapestry under an impossibly vast blue sky. The pace was relentless. Wake before dawn, hitch the oxen, eat a meager breakfast of hardtack and coffee, and begin the day's arduous march. 15 miles a day was considered good progress, each mile a tiny victory against the immense distances. Elias walked mostly, leading his oxen, Bess the mare tethered behind, saving his weight for the beasts. His boots quickly became caked in dust, then mud, then dust again, each step a dull thud against the endless earth. The camaraderie within their small company grew from necessity. They learned to pitch tents in unison, to share the burden of guard duty, to ration water with grim precision. Silas's booming laughter, once jarring, became a welcome sound. Thomas Miller, the schoolteacher, would occasionally read aloud from his Odyssey by the campfire, his quiet voice weaving tales of ancient heroes that felt oddly fitting to their own epic journey. But the plains were not all beauty and brotherhood. They were also a place of crushing monotony and sudden, brutal danger. The sun, once a gentle companion, became a relentless enemy, baking the earth and beating down on their heads. Dust, fine and pervasive, became their constant companion, coating their throats, stinging their eyes, settling into every crease of their clothes and skin. Then came the Platte River. For weeks, they followed its wide, shallow, muddy course, a deceptively placid ribbon of water that offered little potable relief. The cattle sickened, the water was alkaline, tasting of bitter earth and regret. And then came the cholera. It began subtly, a quiet sickness that moved through the wagon trains like a spectral reaper. One day, a man would complain of a stomachache. The next, he would be convulsing, drained of life by horrifying speed, his skin cold and blue. It struck their company just east of Chimney Rock, a distinctive natural landmark that offered a fleeting moment of wonder before the grim reality of the trail reasserted itself. Old Mr. Henderson, the patriarch of the religious family, was the first. He collapsed on the trail one afternoon. By midnight, he was gone, buried in a shallow, unmarked grave, his wife and children weeping silently, their prayers swallowed by the vast, indifferent prairie. 2 days later, it took Thomas Miller, the quiet schoolteacher, who had read of Homer's heroes, succumbed with agonizing speed. Elias, Silas, and the remaining Henderson boy dug his grave, their faces grim, their movements mechanical. Elias took the worn copy of the Odyssey from Miller's tent, intending to return it to his family, but held it close, a silent testament to the fragility of their grand expedition. The cheerful songs around the campfire ceased. The easy jokes died on their lips. The endless plains, once a canvas of hope, now felt like a vast, open grave. Every dawn was a desperate prayer that no one else would wake with the telltale cramps. Every night, Elias lay awake, listening to the coughing and groaning of the camp, fear a cold knot in his stomach. The whisper from the west, once a golden promise, had turned into the chilling rustle of a shroud. The journey had barely begun, and already death was a familiar traveler. Chapter 5. Crossing the Great Divide, leaving the endless, flat expanse of the plains felt, at first, like a reprieve. The dusty monotony gave way to the broken, rugged beauty of the Rocky Mountains. But the relief was short-lived, replaced by a new, more formidable adversary, the merciless terrain itself. The trail narrowed, winding through canyons and along precipitous ledges. The oxen, already lean from the cholera and the alkaline water, struggled with the inclines, their progress slowed to a crawl, sometimes only 5 miles a day. Each step a battle against gravity and jagged rock. The thin mountain air, crisp and cold, made breathing a conscious effort, especially after the choking dust of the plains. Crossing the Great Divide at South Pass, a surprisingly gentle ascent for such a monumental geographical feature, felt anticlimactic. There were no dramatic peaks to scale, no terrifying drops, but the pass marked a profound psychological shift. They were no longer heading to something. They were heading over something, a point of no return. Beyond lay the arid, unknown lands of the Great Basin, a realm of sagebrush, alkali, and thirst. The weather became as volatile as their spirits. One moment, the sun beat down with brutal intensity, reflecting off the pale rocks. The next, dark thunderheads would roll in, unleashing torrential downpours that turned the dusty trails into treacherous, muddy slides. Hailstorms, sudden and violent, would pelt them, leaving the ground temporarily white as if with premature snow. Their dwindling company was tested. The Henderson family, having lost their patriarch and now their youngest daughter to a fever in the mountains, grew silent and withdrawn. Mrs. Henderson moved like a ghost, her eyes empty, her faith seemingly shattered by the wilderness. They spoke only in hushed tones, clinging to each other in a desperate huddle. Silas, ever the pragmatic, grew irritable. Damn mountains. They take more than they give, he grumbled one evening as they struggled to get a fire going with damp wood. Ought to be gold in these peaks, not just blasted rock and misery. Elias, too, felt the weariness seep into his bones, a constant ache that even sleep couldn't erase. He worried about Clara, about the farm, about the money he had borrowed. He imagined her alone in Pennsylvania, her quiet strength perhaps broken by the isolation. He clutched the small Bible she had given him, its familiar leather worn smooth by his desperate grip, feeling the weight of his promise to return. The internal tensions within the company grew. Arguments over rations, over whose turn it was to scout, over the best way to cross a raging mountain stream became frequent and bitter. Men, pushed to their physical and emotional limits, found their tempers frayed, their patience thin. One afternoon, as they navigated a particularly steep and rocky section of trail, one of Silas's oxen stumbled, throwing its weight against the others. The wagon, already teetering on the edge of a narrow path, lurched dangerously. Elias rushed to help, grabbing the lead ox's halter. "Watch it, man. You'll send us all into the ravine." Silas roared, his face red with effort and frustration. "I am watching it. If you'd lighten your load, like I said we should, back on the Platte, this wouldn't be happening." Elias retorted, the words sharp. Silas had stubbornly held onto a heavy, ornate trunk from his old smithy shop, convinced it contained family heirloom. A tense silence fell. Men on the trail learned quickly that arguments could quickly escalate into violence, and violence could mean death in this unforgiving wilderness. Silas, after a moment, simply nodded grimly and went back to wrestling his oxen, the trunk remaining stubbornly on his wagon. The true toll of the mountains, however, was in the constant, gnawing erosion of hope. The gold seemed further away with every tortuous mile. The prospect of immense wealth, once a vibrant beacon, became a dim, flickering light in the face of such overwhelming hardship. Men began to question their sanity, their decisions. Was this truly worth it? Was any amount of gold worth the sacrifice of lives, of sanity, of all they held dear? As they finally descended into the Great Basin, leaving the majestic, yet brutal, peaks of the Rockies behind, Elias looked back. The mountains stood like silent sentinels, stark and beautiful, but also filled with the ghosts of those who had failed to cross. He carried the scars of that crossing, both visible and invisible, a constant reminder that the journey was not just a path through geography, but a trial by fire. The endless plains had tested their endurance, but the Great Divide had begun to strip them of their illusions. Chapter 6. The Salt Desert's Toll. The descent from the Rockies brought them not to paradise, but to the inferno. The Great Basin, a vast, arid expanse that stretched for hundreds of miles, greeted them with an alien, hostile landscape. Here, the earth was not green, but a monotonous palette of pale browns, grays, and the stark white of alkali flats. The air shimmered with heat, distorting the distant mountains into hazy mirages, tantalizing visions of water that never materialized. This was the infamous Salt Desert, the most dreaded leg of the entire journey. The first days were marked by a desperate search for potable water. The springs they encountered were often brackish, turning their stomachs and sickening the oxen. The sun beat down with relentless ferocity, sucking the moisture from their bodies, leaving their lips cracked and bleeding, their throats raw with thirst. Dust, thick and choking, billowed behind the wagons, coating everything in a fine, white powder that tasted of salt and desolation. The trail was littered with the ghosts of those who had gone before. Abandoned wagons, their canvas rotting, lay like bleached skeletons on the plain. Heaps of discarded possessions, fine furniture, heavy tools, barrels of flour-marked points of absolute desperation, where men had shed everything for the faint hope of survival. The stench of death was pervasive. The rotting carcasses of oxen and horses, victims of thirst and exhaustion, providing a grim warning. Their remaining water barrels, carefully rationed, were dwindling with alarming speed. The Henderson family, now just a mother and 2 young sons, had sunk into a despair so profound they barely spoke. Mrs. Henderson sat hunched in her wagon, her eyes staring blankly at the shimmering horizon, her children clinging to her, Silas, too, was breaking. The boisterous blacksmith who had once scoffed at caution was now a gaunt, hollow-eyed man, his once hearty laughter replaced by a dry, rasping cough. He muttered curses to himself, his gaze constantly sweeping the horizon for any sign of water, his hands trembling. "We need water, Elias," he rasped one sweltering afternoon, his voice barely a whisper. "The oxen won't last another day without it. We won't." Elias knew it. His own tongue felt like sandpaper in his mouth. His head pounded with the heat. He looked at Bess, his mare, her head hanging low, her breath ragged. He looked at his oxen, their sides sunken, their eyes dull with suffering. The decision was made. They would risk a shortcut that cut across a particularly desolate, waterless stretch, hoping to reach the next spring before their last drops of water ran out. It was a gamble of life and death, but staying on the main, longer trail meant certain demise. They pushed the oxen relentlessly, their shouts hoarse, their whips cracking against the weary hides. The landscape blurred into a hallucinatory expanse of salt and sagebrush. The heat intensified, the air so dry it felt like it was tearing at their lungs. Then disaster struck. One of Silas's remaining oxen collapsed. It lay on the scorching earth, its flanks heaving, its eyes rolling. It was done. Silas stumbled from his wagon, a desperate cry tearing from his throat. He tried to pull the ox, to cajole it, to beat it, but the animal was beyond help. Its eyes slowly glazed over. "No, no, you bastard, get up." Silas screamed, tears and sweat carving paths through the dust on his face. He fumbled for his rifle. Elias saw the madness in his eyes. He knew what Silas was about to do, put the animal out of its misery, but also abandon his wagon. The old, ornate trunk, the one Silas had clung to so stubbornly, would have to be left behind. "Silas, no," Elias said, stepping forward. "Don't waste the shot. We need it for game, for defense." Silas ignored him, raising the rifle. "It ain't leaving me here. I ain't leaving my family's last bit of... It ain't leaving me." A shot rang out, sharp and deafening in the vast silence of the desert. The ox convulsed once, then lay still. Silas stood over the body, his shoulders shaking. Then, with a profound, guttural roar of despair, he began to throw the contents of his wagon onto the scorching earth. The heavy trunk, the heirlooms he had dragged across a continent, landed with a thud, scattering dust. Plates, blankets, tools, everything that weighed more than life itself. "It ain't worth it," he screamed, his voice raw with grief and rage. "No gold is worth this. It ain't worth it." Elias helped Silas salvage a few essential bags of flour and coffee, loading them onto his own already groaning wagon. The discarded trunk lay in the sun, a monument to a broken dream, another casualty of the salt desert. They pushed on, fueled by a terrifying, desperate hope. Hours bled into an eternity. Elias saw mirages, shimmering lakes of cool water that vanished as they approached. He heard voices in the wind, whispers of home, of Clara, of the quiet fields of Pennsylvania. He pressed a hand to his stomach, feeling the familiar, reassuring bulk of the Bible in his pocket. Don't lose yourself. Finally, as the sun began its descent, painting the western sky in hues of blood and fire, they saw it, not a mirage, a faint green line on the horizon, a promise of life, a spring. The last few miles were agony. The oxen stumbled, nearly collapsing. Elias dragged himself forward, his throat burning, his vision blurring. He reached the spring, a small, muddy pool of salvation, and fell to his knees, burying his face in the blessed, cool water. It tasted of earth and life and the tears he finally allowed himself to shed. They had survived, but the salt desert had taken its toll. It had stripped them bare, not just of possessions, but of illusions. The dream of easy gold had evaporated under the desert sun, replaced by the grim reality of survival. Elias looked back at the desolate expanse, a graveyard of ambitions, and knew that the man who had left Pennsylvania was long gone, burned away in the crucible of the journey. The gilded horizon now seemed impossibly far, almost a cruel joke. The true gold, he realized, was simply drawing another breath. Chapter 7. San Francisco, a canvas of mud and dreams. The descent from the Sierra Nevada was a slow, weary unraveling of the journey's final, brutal phase. Elias, Silas, and the surviving Henderson family Mrs. Henderson and her two gaunt, silent sons tumbled out of the mountains like broken flotsam washed ashore. The vast, golden-brown expanse of the Sacramento Valley unfolded before them, not the lush Eden they had perhaps dreamed of, but a parched, sun-baked land that felt like another test. Their oxen, now skeletal and weak, stumbled along, their last reserves of strength expended. Elias's own body felt like a bag of aching bones, every muscle screaming in protest. His face was a landscape of dust and sun-whip. His hazel eyes, once restless, now held a deep-seated weariness that no amount of sleep could cure. The journey had stripped them bare, leaving behind only the raw, resilient core of their will to survive. They reached Sutter's Fort, once a lonely outpost, now a bustling, chaotic hub of commerce and desperation. It was here that they finally learned the true, brutal reality of California. The easy gold of 48 was largely gone. The streams were not paved with nuggets. They were choked with men. From Sutter's Fort, they continued their staggered journey towards San Francisco, a city that everyone said was the true heart of the gold rush, the gateway to wealth. The road was barely a road, a churned-up track of dust and ruts, choked with a seemingly endless procession of men, mules, and wagons. When Elias first glimpsed San Francisco Bay, it was not the majestic sight he might have imagined. A thick, oppressive fog clung to the hills, shrouding the city in a perpetual gray gloom. As they drew closer, the fog began to lift, revealing a sight that defied belief. A sprawling, chaotic metropolis that had seemingly materialized out of nothing. San Francisco was less a city and more a grand, audacious improvisation. It was a canvas of mud and dreams, a dizzying collage of tents, flimsy shacks, and hastily erected wooden buildings, all crammed together on the steep, sandy hills surrounding the bay. The streets were quagmires of churned mud, made impassable by the constant flow of traffic and the relentless, driving ambition of its inhabitants. The waterfront was a forest of masts, hundreds of ships, abandoned by their crews who had rushed to the goldfields, lay rotting at anchor, their sails flapping uselessly in the wind. Their rotting hulks were being repurposed, dragged ashore, and turned into stores, saloons, and even makeshift hotels. The air thrummed with a cacophony of sounds, the hammer of carpenters, the shouts of vendors hawking their wares, the drunken laughter from saloons, the multilingual babble of men from every corner of the globe, Mexicans, Hawaiians, Chinese, Irish, Germans, Yankees, Southerners, all blended into a bewildering, vibrant tapestry of humanity, all driven by the same singular obsession: gold. "Lord, preserve us," Mrs. Henderson whispered, clutching her sons, her eyes wide with a mixture of awe and terror. After the stark solitude of the desert, the sheer overwhelming density of human life felt like another kind of wilderness. Elias felt a surge of exhilaration despite his exhaustion. This was it. This was the promised land. This sprawling mad city was the crucible, where fortunes were made or lost. He could almost taste the opportunity in the air, a heady mix of raw ambition and the faint, underlying scent of desperation. They camped on the outskirts, their small collection of wagons, a tiny island in a sea of tents. The next morning, Elias and Silas ventured into the heart of the city, leaving the Hendersons to guard their meager possessions. The prices were the first shock. Everything cost a fortune. A simple meal of salted pork and hardtack cost more than a day's wages back in Pennsylvania. A cup of coffee was $1. Housing was astronomical. A cat in a communal tent could cost $5 a night. The gold they had yet to find was already flowing out of their pockets into the hands of merchants, tavern keepers, and ferrymen. "This ain't no place for a poor man," Silas grumbled. His eyes narrowed as he watched a well-dressed man in a silk hat emerge from a gambling saloon, his pockets bulging. "Looks like you need gold just to live long enough to find gold." They sold their remaining oxen for a pitiful sum, barely enough to buy a few essential mining tools: a pickaxe, a shovel, and a tin pan. Elias kept Bess, his mare, a silent companion who had survived the harrowing journey. He couldn't bring himself to part with her. They walked the muddy streets, listening to the rumors, the exaggerated tales of fabulous strikes, and the grim realities of empty claims. The easy gold, the surface gold, was gone. What remained was in the foothills, requiring backbreaking labor and a good measure of luck. The city was a dizzying contradiction, a place of squalor and sudden wealth, of lawlessness and burgeoning order. Vigilance committees formed to keep the peace, dispensing a rough justice with swift, brutal efficiency. But even amidst the chaos, Elias saw the undeniable signs of it. Future banks were being built, brick buildings rising from the mud, shops overflowing with goods from every corner of the globe. Men were not just digging for gold, they were building a new society, fast and furious. "We need to get to the diggings," Elias said to Silas, cutting through the din of the city. "This city will eat us alive before we even get a chance." Silas nodded, his eyes grim. The initial awe had worn off, replaced by a grim determination. "Which way, then, plowboy? North? South? Everyone's got a different idea of where the big one is." Elias pulled out a crudely drawn map he had bought for an exorbitant price. He pointed to a region in the northern mines, along the Yuba River. "They say it's rich, but harder to get to. Fewer men." It was a gamble, like every decision they had made since leaving Pennsylvania. But standing in the swirling, muddy heart of San Francisco, Elias felt a strange, renewed sense of purpose. He had faced the plains, the mountains, the desert. He would face the goldfield. He had come too far to turn back now. The canvas of mud and dreams awaited his mark. Chapter 8. Stake Your Claim. The journey from San Francisco to the northern mines was a continuation of the same relentless hardship, albeit on a smaller scale. Elias and Silas, along with the steadfast Henderson family, acquired a few pack mules with their remaining funds and struck out for the foothills. The trails were rougher, steeper, winding through stands of pine and oak, a welcome change from the desolate plains, but no less arduous. They chose a remote area along the North Fork of the Yuba River, a region rumored to still hold untapped pockets of gold, though requiring more effort to extract. Elias, with his farmer's eye for land and water, found a promising spot, a gravel bar where the river curved, creating a natural eddy that might trap heavier gold particles. "This is it," he announced, his voice echoing in the quiet wilderness, a stark contrast to the cacophony of San Francisco. "We'll set up camp here." Their camp was a meager affair. 2 tattered canvas tents pitched under the shade of towering ponderosa pines, a small campfire, and their few, precious tools. The mules were tethered nearby, grazing on the sparse grass. The Henderson boys, young but hardened by the trail, helped set up, their movements quiet and efficient. Mrs. Henderson, still withdrawn, found a small, flat rock to sit on, watching the river with vacant eyes. The first task was to stake their claim. This was a critical, often contentious, ritual. Following the unwritten laws of the goldfields, Elias and Silas measured out a plot of land roughly 100 feet along the river and extending back to the hillside, marking its boundaries with wooden stakes and crude handwritten notices. Elias Thorne and Silas Croft. Elias carved into a pine plank, claim number 37, Yuba River, North Fork. As he hammered the last stake into the ground, a profound sense of ownership, hard-won and fragile, settled over him. This was not the inherited land of Pennsylvania, but a piece of wilderness he had earned with sweat and blood, a place where he would either make his fortune or lose himself entirely. The work began immediately, a relentless, back-breaking regimen that made farming seem like a gentle pastime. Elias rose before dawn, the mountain air biting cold. He would eat a quick, meager breakfast of boiled coffee and hardtack, then head to the river. The process was simple in theory, brutal in practice. First, they dug the pay dirt, the gravel, sand, and clay from the riverbed and banks that might contain gold. Elias and Silas would dig, shoveling tons of earth into canvas bags or directly into their rocker box. The rocker box, or cradle, was a simple wooden device. It consisted of a perforated screen at the top, a canvas apron beneath, and a series of riffles, small wooden bars at the bottom. One man would shovel dirt into the top screen, while the other poured buckets of river water over it and rocked the box back and forth. The water and agitation would wash away the lighter sand and gravel, allowing the heavier gold particles to settle into the riffles. Hour after hour, day after day, Elias stood knee-deep in the icy mountain water, shoveling, rocking, his muscles screaming, his hands raw and perpetually waterlogged. The noise was constant. The rhythmic scraping of shovels, the splash of water, the grating sound of gravel tumbling through the rocker box. The initial days were filled with a gnawing anxiety. The riffles yielded nothing but black sand, tiny worthless flecks of magnetite. Hope, a fragile thing, dwindled with each empty pan. Silas, his boisterousness long gone, cursed under his breath. Damn all this. Not even enough to buy a decent meal. We crossed half a continent for this. But Elias, the farmer, understood patience. He understood the slow, methodical work of coaxing yield from reluctant earth. He remembered the feel of a plow in stubborn soil, the long wait for harvest. He kept shoveling. The camp was not just a place of work, but of constant vigilance. Other miners, solitary figures or small groups, worked claims nearby. Some were friendly, offering advice or a shared pipe of tobacco. Others were suspicious, their eyes constantly scanning for trespassers or easy marks. The threat of claim jumping, theft, and violence was an ever-present shadow. Elias kept his rifle clean and close. Weeks bled into months. The sun grew hotter, the days longer. Elias's body hardened into a lean, sinewy machine. His mind, however, often wandered back to Pennsylvania, to Clara's face, to the quiet farmhouse. Was she well? Had the bank taken the farm? The isolation was profound, the connection to his past tenuous. One sweltering afternoon, as the sun beat down on the canyon, Elias had just emptied a particularly rich-looking pan of concentrate from the rocker box into his gold pan. He swirled the water, gently washing away the last of the black sand. Then he saw it, a tiny, unmistakable glitter. Not just dust, but small, flattened flakes, shimmering with an undeniable, pure yellow light. Color? He gasped, his voice catching in his throat. Silas, look. Silas, who had been resting his aching back against a tree, stumbled over. His eyes widened. By God, Elias, you found it. It wasn't a nugget the size of a hen's egg, not a fortune in a single pan, but it was there. Gold. Real, tangible gold. The initial thrill was intoxicating, a powerful jolt of adrenaline that surged through Elias's weary body. He held the pan up, letting the sunlight dance on the precious flakes. It was proof. Proof that the journey had not been in vain. Proof that the gilded horizon was not just a cruel mirage. They had staked their claim, and the elusive color had finally appeared, offering a tantalizing glimpse of the fortune that might lie buried beneath their feet. Chapter 9, The Color of Fortune. The discovery of the first flakes of gold in their claim ignited a frantic energy within Elias and Silas. The weary resignation that had settled over them during the lean weeks was replaced by a potent, almost manic enthusiasm. The dull ache in their muscles was suddenly bearable. The freezing river water, less biting. They had found the color, and with it, a renewed, intoxicating hope. They worked with a desperate intensity, fueled by the promise that shimmered in their pans. Elias, with his methodical farmer's instinct, began to observe the river, the way the current moved, where the heavier gravel tended to settle. He experimented with digging in different spots along their claim, learning the subtle geology of the riverbed. Silas, despite his earlier cynicism, attacked the pay dirt with a renewed vigor, his powerful arms shoveling tons of earth into the rocker box. The small flecks soon became coarser gold, then tiny, irregular nuggets, some no larger than a grain of rice, others the size of a pea. Each discovery was met with a shared, guttural grunt of satisfaction, a small victory in their brutal war against the earth. Their daily take grew, from a few cents worth of dust to several dollars worth of small gold. They carefully collected it in a leather poke, a small deerskin bag that grew heavier and more satisfying with each passing day. Elias would weigh it each evening by the campfire, using a tiny set of brass scales he had bought in San Francisco. The sight of the scales tipping, the gold outweighing the small brass weights, was a thrill that surpassed any harvest he had ever known. This is it, Elias, Silas exclaimed one evening, his eyes gleaming in the firelight. He held a particularly large flake between his calloused thumb and forefinger. This is what we came for. This is what all the misery was for. Elias nodded, a rare smile gracing his sun-baked face. He thought of Clara, of the debts, of the crumbling farm. $600. That was the number in his head. the amount needed to lift the burden from their shoulders. The gold poke felt like salvation. Their success, however modest by the standards of the truly rich strikes, did not go unnoticed. Other miners, working upstream and downstream, would cast envious glances their way. The goldfields operated on a brutal, immediate form of social hierarchy. Those who had color and those who did not. Elias and Silas now had color. One afternoon, a lone miner, a wiry man with a perpetual sneer named Cutter, approached their claim. He had been working a barren section downstream for weeks. "Looks like you boys struck a lucky vein," Cutter said, his eyes narrowing as he watched Elias scoop a pan of rich gravel. "Plenty of good color there. Just hard work, same as anyone else," Elias replied, his hand resting casually on the pickaxe handle. The unspoken threat in the goldfields was always present. "Hard work and luck," Cutter sneered. "Some men got it, some don't. Maybe your luck will run out." He lingered for a moment, his eyes sweeping over their claim, then walked away, a lingering sense of menace in his wake. Elias and Silas understood the warning. Success bred envy, and envy bred trouble. They increased their vigilance, taking turns on guard duty at night. Their rifle was always within reach. The gold, once a symbol of hope, now also carried the weight of danger. Despite the underlying tension, the days were filled with a profound sense of purpose. They were no longer just surviving. They were building towards something tangible. The small gold poke was not just metal. It was freedom. It was a future. One morning, Elias decided to try digging in a spot where a large, ancient oak tree had fallen years ago, its roots tearing up a section of the riverbank. He knew that gold, being heavy, often settled in natural traps like root systems. He spent hours hacking away at the hardened clay and tangled roots, his pickaxe ringing against hidden rocks. Then, with a dull thud, his pickaxe hit something soft. He dug around it, his heart beginning to hammer. It was not a rock. He carefully scraped away the last of the dirt. It was a nugget, not a hen's egg, but larger than any they had found before, perhaps an ounce or more. It gleamed with a dull, satisfying luster in his hand, heavy and solid. Elias gasped, the air catching in his throat. "Silas, look," he shouted, his voice cracking with emotion. Silas dropped his shovel and scrambled over, his eyes wide. He took the nugget, turning it over in his palm. "By God, Elias, a real one, a true piece of the elephant." The term "seeing the elephant" was gold rush slang for experiencing the full spectrum of the goldfields, both the good and the bad. This was undoubtedly the good. The exhilaration was overwhelming. This single nugget represented days, perhaps weeks, of back-breaking labor. It was a concrete symbol of their triumph, a tangible reward for their brutal journey. They celebrated that night by sharing a rare bottle of whiskey, their voices rough with laughter. "This is it, Elias," Silas declared, his face flushed with whiskey and success. "We're almost there. We'll be rich men. We'll go back to Oak Haven, buy out the whole damn town." Elias smiled, the warmth of the whiskey spreading through him. He imagined Clara's face, her relief, her pride. He saw the farmhouse, debt-free, secure. This was the color of fortune, a vibrant, dazzling promise after so much gray despair. But even as he celebrated, a tiny, insidious thought flickered in the back of Elias's mind. The rush of finding gold was addictive, a powerful drug. One nugget led to the craving for another, then another. The desire for enough subtly shifted, blurring the line between necessity and avarice. He had come for $600 to save his farm, but now, with a small fortune in his poke, he wondered, was that truly enough? The gilded horizon beckoned, not just with salvation, but with limitless, intoxicating wealth. The initial romance of the gold had turned into a burning fever, and Elias knew, with a chilling certainty, that it was easy to get lost in its glow.